Right.
Right. I mean, like when I was writing that,
Oh, thank goodness. Okay, and here is, and if you wouldn't mind standing up there next to the microphone.
I think I'm waiting for someone to introduce.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Oh, we have a picture.
My name is Walter Harris. I'm probably the oldest member on the board of directors for the Chatham County Historical Association. That's why I got stabbed and told this would be my job to welcome you. For those of you who know me, you'll be happy to know I'm cutting 20 minutes out of what I was going to say because we're behind. First of all, this is the first speaker for the Gene Brooks speakers meetings that we're going to have. Some of you were privileged to know Gene either as a friend, some as a teacher. But we welcome you if you have not had a chance to go downstairs, go through the museum and look at the things there. Look at the pictures. Can you believe it's been 15 years since the fire? And also, there in the small anteroom, there is the fire.
It's been 15 years? I lived here.
2010, yes. Who would have thought? Time flies when you're having fun.
My goodness.
So I'll hush. But I want to invite you also to look in the small room at the pictures by Frank Lloyd London. It's quite an impressive thing that he has displayed there. But welcome. We're delighted you're here. Look at the benefits that you get if you belong to the association. And I can say one of the benefits I've had from it is longevity. So,
So my name is Cindy Schmidt, and I'm the secretary for the organization. And I'd like to introduce our speaker today. So Angela Thorpe Mason is the cultural heritage leader, public historian like us, and scholar based out of Durham, North Carolina. For a decade, she's worked to share the stories of Black Southern experience and to amplify those stories of marginalized communities. She does that through archives, museums, historic sites, and things like today. She has experience in cultural resource management, organizational development, community programming, strategic planning, and communications. She graduated from University of Florida, nobody hold that against you, with a BA in history and a minor in African American studies. She earned a Master of Arts in History with a concentration in museum studies at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She served as the director of the North Carolina American Heritage Commission, where she was instrumental in transitioning that commission from the North Carolina Arts Council to be an independent division under the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Because of her work to share the social impact and economic possibilities of sites like the Pauli Murray Center, she was selected to be a member of the Leadership Raleigh class, number 43, and a member of the first class of the Association of African American Museums and Howard University School of Business Advanced Executive Programs for Museums. We're very delighted to have her here today to talk about Pauli Murray. Please welcome Angela Thorpe.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are we doing? Great. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So this mic is picking me up. Also, I'm going to do my best to project. So something that I do as a public historian is try my darndest not to just talk at people. So today we're going to have a little bit of interactivity. If you're familiar with the great Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, you will know that she has such an expansive life. And so what I'm going to try to do today is cover a bit of an arc of her life. We'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and I'll try my best to leave time for question and answer at the end. How many of you are familiar with Pauli Murray? You can raise your hands, give a shout. Wonderful. So most of the folks in this room. So you can think of this conversation as a way to maybe come into deeper relationship with Pauli Murray and an opportunity to get to know a bit more. I hope that for those of you who are familiar, you come away with information you did not know before. I like to remind folks that nobody remarkable happens in a vacuum, and that includes the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. So I'm actually going to start by talking about some of the people who raised Pauli. You're going to see a couple on your screen on your left-hand side, and some of you might be familiar with the woman in this picture, Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald. Have you all heard of Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald? Okay, so some of us have, being from this area. For some of us, Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald is going to be new. So these folks are Pauli Murray's grandparents. They had a deep, deep impact on Pauli Murray's life and also ended up raising Pauli Murray. Robert Fitzgerald, who you see there on the left, is a Black man who I like to say never knew bondage. He was born free in Delaware, later spent his adolescence and young adulthood in Pennsylvania. He was entering a teacher training program at Ashman Institute, a place we now commonly know as Lincoln University in Pennsylvania when the Civil War broke out. And so he chose to serve in the Civil War. Fun fact for some people, at the time that the Civil War broke out, the U.S. Navy was not segregated. The U.S. Army was. So he first served in the Navy before later serving in the U.S. Army as a U.S. colored troop. And so Robert Fitzgerald quite literally fought for the liberation of Black people in this country. After the war, he took up that training again to be a teacher, but decided that he was ready to actually go south and teach. And so Robert taught in freedmen's schools in Virginia and in North Carolina, including in Goldsboro and Hillsboro, where he would meet his wife, Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald, who you see there on the right. Cornelia Smith was born not too far from where we are today, between Orange and Chatham counties. Her father was an enslaver, Sidney Smith of the Smith Plantation here in this region. Farrington Village actually is on a portion of that former land. Her mother was an enslaved woman named Harriet. And Cornelia Smith is really interesting. She lived kind of an in-between life. Sidney Smith's sister, Mary Ruffin Smith, ended up raising Cornelia in sort of the big house on the plantation. And so again, had a different life experience than the remainder of the Black children and the enslaved children that would have been on that plantation. I'll also offer that Mary Ruffin Smith was a major benefactor to UNC Chapel Hill, as well as Chapel of the Cross, where Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald was baptized. And so again, it's these two folks, a man who never knew bondage and an enslaved child who was liberated during the Civil War, who ultimately raised 6 children between this region and Durham, North Carolina. Those children included a daughter named Agnes, who you see seated in the middle here, and also a daughter named Pauline, who you see just to the left on your screen. Anybody have any guesses as to who this small child is with the purple circle around their face? Who might that be? Any guesses? Pauli Murray. That's a very young Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray was born in 1910 to Agnes Murray and William Murray. Agnes was a nurse and was training at Hampton University in Virginia when she met a teacher named William that would go on to be her future husband. And they gave birth to 6 children in Baltimore, Maryland. And Pauli Murray is the 4th of those 6 children. Unfortunately, Agnes Murray passed away when Pauli Murray was about 3 or 4 years old. She died of a cerebral hemorrhage when she was pregnant with her 7th child. And William Murray had suffered deeply from depression, but his wife's passing caused him to sink into an even deeper depression. And so those children were split up across family members in Baltimore. I'll offer that Agnes had a pact with her sister Pauline, who again you see there on the left. If anything ever happens to me, please care for your namesake as your own. And so Pauline made good on that promise, went up to Baltimore, picked up Pauli Murray, who was born, again, Anna Pauli Murray, and took her to Durham, North Carolina, where she was raised in the home that you see here on the right, the Fitzgerald family home. I'll offer that not long after these events took place, William Murray was later institutionalized in a mental institution, Crownsville State Hospital, which is still outside of Baltimore, Maryland today. There he was unfortunately murdered by a white guard as an act of retaliation, an act of racial terror, violence, we might call it. And so Pauli Murray was effectively orphaned by the time she was 13 years old. But I'll offer this home that you see on the right was certainly a house of love for her. You can imagine a toddler with 2 grandparents, a pretty stern aunt. It was something of a different experience for Pauli, but she was a lively child, a mischievous child, and definitely kept everyone in that household on their toes. Pauli was raised, again, in a home that you just saw, a home that still stands today in the historically Black, historically working class neighborhood in Durham that we call the West End. The home that you saw on the previous slide was built by Pauli Murray's grandfather in 1898, and there it still stands proudly today. But again, this home that was built by grandfather Fitzgerald's hands is the home where Pauli Murray ultimately was raised. Pauli Murray attended schools in Durham, North Carolina, including West End Graded School, where her Aunt Pauline taught. That did not keep her from getting into mischief at school, despite the fact that, again, her aunt was a teacher there. I'll also offer that Pauli Murray attended a historically Black high school in Durham that still stands today, called Hillside High School. And there, Pauli went until what we would consider today the 11th grade. That is where school ended at the time. Now, we've got to remember, this is a period of deep, deep segregation, including in Durham. Pauli Murray grew up in the Jim Crow South. And so Pauli, even though she was a shoo-in to get into North Carolina Central University, had no interest in attending a segregated school. And so convinced Aunt Pauline to let her enroll at Hunter College in New York City. But because, again, she had that 11th grade education, she did not quite meet all of the entrance requirements at Hunter College. So she had to take another year of schooling in New York City before she was prepared to enter Hunter College. And yet she did. This is sort of Pauli Murray's earliest forms of protest, if you will, saying I'm not attending a segregated school, but also very, very early inklings of Pauli's strong determination, right? Not only am I not attending a segregated school, I'm going to go where I want to go, and I'm going to do all that I can to get into that institution. Ultimately, Pauli earns a second diploma in 1927 that again allows her to meet the entrance requirements at Hunter College. I'll offer that it's really Pauli's time as a college student where she begins to experiment with her gender identity and her sexual identity. Again, Pauli was named Anna Pauli Murray. When Pauli gets to college, she chooses the gender neutral spelling, Pauli, as her name, sort of taking on a gender neutral Pauli Murray. You'll see here also, Pauli began to play with dress and hairstyle, working towards a more male gender expression. And this is a journey that Pauli would go on through much of her adult life. As a young person, as a 30-something, even as an early 40-something, Pauli was consulting with doctors to understand how she could live into a more male identity. Pauli sought hormone therapy when at this time it was very, very experimental. I'll offer that Pauli sort of put this baton down when she reached her mid-40s. And so if you read about Pauli Murray today, if you see conversations, films, texts on Pauli Murray today, you might see people refer to Pauli Murray by different pronouns. You might see people refer to Pauli as he, as she, or as they. And these are some of the reasons why. Again, we know that Pauli was doing that active experimentation. Now, again, Pauli graduates from Hunter College in 1933 at the age of 23. And this is your first pop quiz, if you will. There is no right or wrong answer. But I'll offer Pauli graduated with a degree in English literature. Is it hard to get a job with a degree in English literature now? Yeah? Okay. You think it might have been hard in 1933? Yeah. What was happening in 1933?
Okay.
The Great Depression. And so it was almost impossible for Pauli to find a job as a writer. And so ultimately, Pauli ends up working for the Works Progress Administration. As a WPA employee, Pauli does several things, including supporting adults in reading, teaching adult literacy. Pauli also works for the WPA doing some labor organizing work. And I'll offer that this work, both doing labor organizing and supporting adult literacy, led to Pauli's next aspiration, which was to be a sociologist. And so she ultimately applied to study sociology as a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill, our state's flagship university, again, not far from where we are today. Pauli Murray was ultimately denied entry to UNC because of her race, because she was Black. And this catalyzed some of Pauli's very early civil rights activism. Again, Pauli is not someone to take no for an answer. And so she started a letter writing campaign, writing to newspapers and individuals and institutions across the country to make her case known. She even appealed to the NAACP to see if they would take this on as a test case to challenge segregation in Southern schools. And they ultimately said no. They thought her case was too weak. But her letter writing campaign caught the eye of someone who you see on this screen. Who is this person that you see on this screen? Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was very intrigued by this person that she called a firebrand. She wanted to understand more about why Pauli was upset about this denial. She wanted to learn more about Pauli's values around equity, around inclusion. And so, again, Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt started exchanging letters. And this became the beginning of what would go on to be a lifelong friendship for the two of them. The two of them regularly exchanged ideas about the plight of Black people in the United States. They exchanged ideas about human rights globally. And again, this relationship took the form of letters, took the forms of sit-downs, took the forms of visits to Mrs. Roosevelt's estate, even after she was First Lady. Again, this was a lifelong friendship. And if you're interested in learning more about this friendship, I encourage you to pick up a book by Dr. Patricia Bell Scott called The Firebrand and the First Lady, which really documents that friendship. Now, Pauli, again, does not get into UNC, needs a job, certainly needs something to do at this point in her life, and so ends up being hired by the Workers' Defense League to advocate on behalf of Black people in the South who were wrongfully incarcerated, and specifically Black people in the South who were wrongfully on death row. I'll also offer, it's around this time that Pauli, again, is traveling across the South doing this work, is on a bus near Fredericksburg, Virginia, refuses to give up her seat on that bus to a white patron, and is ultimately arrested for that act. This is about 40 years before Rosa Parks did the same. This is another case that Pauli appealed to the NAACP saying, hey, can y'all take this on? Can you challenge segregation on public transit in the South? NAACP says no again. And so Pauli is catalyzed to do something else, right? She's like, my writing is not working. My sort of active protest with my body is not working. I'm going to see if I can challenge legal segregation legally. I'm going to actually take a shot at being a lawyer to see if I can do some of this myself, since these lawyers are saying no to me. And so Pauli enrolls at Howard University School of Law at the age of 30 years old, again, with the aspiration of being a civil rights attorney. You'll see here, Pauli is on the bottom row, second to the right. And how many women are in that class? Just Pauli, quite literally, just Pauli. It is the experience of being the only woman in her law school class. She was ridiculed by her male classmates, not taken seriously by her male professors, that led her to coin a term, Jane Crow, to describe the dual experience of experiencing segregation as somebody who was both Black and both a woman. And I like to call this sort of the grandmother term to a term that some of us are more familiar with today, called intersectionality. Again, Pauli is one of the first people to put language to this experience. Pauli is deeply engaged in activism in Washington, D.C. While at Howard University School of Law, she organized one of the first sit-ins in Washington, D.C. to protest segregation in D.C. restaurants. She also supported undergraduate students in organizing and doing direct action work. And so again, Pauli is deeply, deeply engaged in activism. And I'll offer, this is in the 1940s, so well before what we consider the modern civil rights movement. Pauli is really putting the foundation for the movement into action. Despite Pauli's experience at Howard, she ultimately graduates at the top of her class. And the person who graduates at the top of their class at Howard University School of Law at this time is designated or entitled entry into Harvard University to study to get a Master of Law. So again, Pauli's getting prepared to pack things up and go to Harvard, and Harvard says, no, 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 not so fast. You can't study here. Why does Harvard say no to Pauli? Is it because she's Black or is it because she's a woman? Woman? Okay, great. It is because she is a woman. At the time, Harvard School of Law is accepting Black people, but they are not accepting women. And this is something else that Pauli appeals even to President Roosevelt, who himself was a graduate. He couldn't even get her in. So Pauli ultimately has to find somewhere else to go to get that LLM, that Master of Law. Pauli ultimately ends up attending the University of California Bolt School of Law. We now know that as the University of California Berkeley School of Law to get that Master of Law. And I'll offer, Pauli was working on a sort of final paper at Howard University School of Law, really toying with this idea of Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, but gets distracted fighting Harvard and never quite turns in that senior paper. Again, she is in California, and it is the racism that she experienced in California that catalyzes her to pick up that paper and keep at it. And this is a good reminder for all of us that racism and anti-Blackness, they're not Southern phenomenon, right? They're national phenomenon, they're global phenomenon. And so again, Pauli is experiencing deep racism in California, picks up that senior paper again, and ultimately turns it in to her professors at Howard, however they accept it. Her primary professor, I don't know that he's pictured in this image, but he's a gentleman you may have heard of, a civil rights attorney named Spotswood Robinson. He takes a look and he's like, the theory in this paper will never work. He quite literally throws it in a drawer. And guess what? 10 years later, he and some of the culprits listed in this picture are working on a huge Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education. And Spotswood Robinson says, wait a second, I actually think we have something that might work. He plucks Pauli's paper out of that drawer, and the theory that she puts forth in that paper goes on to be the theory that this legal team uses to win Brown versus Board of Education. And Pauli Murray never got credit. She learned that this team used her paper when she was in her 50s, paying a visit back to Howard University School of Law. And so this, I think, illuminates some of the complications with some of our heroes, right? A legal team of men who used a young woman's legal theory, but failed to credit her at all in any way for something that's absolutely groundbreaking. Pauli Murray followed her time in California with a brief stint as a legal clerk in New York City, and then also some time in private practice in New York City as a civil rights attorney. In 1948, Pauli Murray ran for city council in New York City for Brooklyn's 10th senatorial district. And though she was ultimately unsuccessful, she did receive the 4th highest vote. And so this just signals to us Pauli's doing a lot of different things, right? Pauli's really trying to get at racial discrimination and sort of create better community through practicing law, but also through trying a hand at politics. In 1951, another really interesting opportunity comes to Pauli that she decides to take. At this point, Pauli is 41 years old, and She was ultimately commissioned by the Women's Division of Christian Service at the United Methodist Church to write what they thought was going to be a pamphlet called States Laws on Race and Color. At this time, the Methodist Church was trying to understand how they could integrate their churches in the U.S. South without being, by still complying with the law. They were trying to understand what in their churches in the South were sort of social customs, and then what were legal realities that they needed to abide by. And so they asked Pauli, can you pull all of the race-based laws in the South for us so that we can understand? And Pauli says, I can do that, but also race-based laws are not Southern things. They exist all over the country. So how about I pull the laws across the United States for you? They thought this was going to be, again, a couple-week project, and this was going to be like a small pamphlet. It turned into about a 2 or 3 year project and ended up being an over 700-page compendium of all of the race-based laws in the United States. And this work, less than 5,000 copies were published, but it ended up being such an important document for civil rights lawyers in the 1950s that were litigating civil rights cases all over the United States. Thurgood Marshall went on to call this work the Bible for civil rights litigators during the civil rights movement. So there goes Pauli again, kind of at the forefront of something. Now, in the beginning of our talk, we chatted about Pauli Murray's original aspiration. What is that degree she graduated with? English literature. What did she want to be? A writer, right? And so Pauli's done this work, right? Worked as a civil rights attorney in private practice. Pauli did the political thing and ran for office. Pauli spent several years writing this compendium of race-based laws. And so ultimately, again, in her 40s, decides, I think it's time for a break. And I think it's time to go back to what I originally wanted to do. So she goes on break, takes a break to write her first novel, Proud Shoes, which was published in 1956. Proud Shoes is considered one of the earliest literary chronicles of Black American life and a Black American family in the United States. How many of us are familiar with the book Roots by Alex Haley? Okay, so this precedes Roots, which is typically much more well-known. Once again, Pauli did it first, okay? This book, again, given its time of being published, 1956, was met with mixed reaction. I'll offer that Southern critics really did not like it, but others were pretty receptive to it. But overall, this book was not successful. Proud Shoes sold less than 5,000 copies, but it was reissued 20 years later in 1978, largely following the success of Roots. And at the time, it was much better received. The royalties that Pauli Murray got from the book in the 70s enabled her to make her first ever luxury purchase, which was a Mercedes. And so, again, she finally saw the fruits of that labor later in the 70s. And that is another book that is available to you today. Has anyone in this audience read Proud Shoes? For those of you who have, you'll agree. It is beautiful. It is like a sweeping genealogical masterpiece, but reads just like a lush, dynamic novel. And so I really encourage you to give it a read, especially if you're interested and learning more about local history, because Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald's history in this region is beautifully and deeply documented in this work. Now, Pauli again takes that break to write a book, and then is thinking, uh-oh, I've got to get back to work, right? Really does not receive royalties from that book. It's not successful, and so she is in need of a job. And so in 1956, at the age of 46, Pauli is hired by the esteemed New York law firm of Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. And there she is the only woman attorney on staff. And I'll offer that Paul Weiss is still one of the top law firms in the United States. It was then, it is now. And so this was huge for Pauli. She's kind of finally making her big break as an attorney. It's at Paul Weiss that Pauli meets her longtime romantic partner, Irene Barlow, who was there as a secretary. A few years after being at Paul Weiss, Pauli gets hired for another really compelling opportunity. Pauli was invited to travel to Ghana, which at the time was a newly independent nation in West Africa, to teach constitutional law and to support attorneys, again, in this newly independent nation around building the bones for the Constitution in Ghana. So there goes Pauli again, really at the forefront of something and really doing that deep infrastructure work. And that's something that I consider global social justice work. So Pauli is taking her work and her talents global. It's also around this time that Pauli gets involved in the civil rights movement. Remember, Pauli had been doing sort of modern civil rights work, civil rights organizing as early as the 30s, and she thinks her wisdom would be really helpful to the modern civil rights movement. But she ultimately distanced herself from the movement and even from leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin because of the movement's treatment of Black women. It's just something that she could not stand for. Now, Pauli moves away from the civil rights movement, but is interested in thinking about what's next for myself. What else can I do? You might think that at this point, Pauli's tired and might want to take a break, but she does not. She goes to school again. Pauli enters Yale University and ultimately graduates with a doctorate of law from Yale University, being the first Black person, male, woman, or otherwise, to do so. Pauli graduates in 1965 at the age of 55. And so some of the story that we're telling is that you have a lifetime to do the work that you are designated to do on this earth. It's while at Yale University that Pauli inspires and shapes some brilliant legal minds, including folks like Eleanor Holmes Norton and Marian Wright Edelman. Those are names that might be familiar to you. It's also during this time at Yale that Pauli says that she begins to develop what she calls a feminist consciousness. Again, Pauli just left the civil rights movement, is taking this time at Yale and is thinking about how can we create a society that is more just and more equitable for women. Okay, she thinks some of the same issues that she's navigated play out in her experience of being a woman. So she's thinking what we really need is like an NAACP for women, a civil rights organization for women. She passes this sort of concept along to someone we may know, Betty Friedan, and they get to working. They sort of pull together a network of women who are interested in this concept, and ultimately, this group of women goes on to found NOW, the National Organization for Women. So Pauli is one of the original founders of the National Organization for Women. And beyond being a founder, she is specifically tasked with building like the infrastructure for the organization. So figuring out how it's going to run, how it's going to operate, how it is going to do business. That is Pauli Murray's critical role with NOW. And she does that work in 1966. I'll offer that Pauli was very vocal with NOW leadership about ensuring that women were broadly included in NOW and in the women's movement. And specifically what Pauli is advocating for is that Black women are broadly included in NOW, and Black women are broadly included in the feminist movement without regard to class or economic status. And this was a position that was very unpopular amongst NOW leaders. This is a place where she saw a lot of friction, and ultimately kind of ended up on an island because NOW leaders did not agree with her. They did not agree that many Black women should be included in the ranks of leadership at NOW, that certainly working class Black women should not be included in the ranks of leadership at NOW, and that Black women's needs did not sort of need to bubble to the top of NOW's priorities. And so this is something, again, that Pauli chose not to stand for, and she ultimately distanced herself from NOW because of that friction. So after this experience, Pauli is in an interesting place. Pauli is single, Pauli is unmarried, and some of what this means is that she needs secure income. Pauli is also sort of creeping into elderhood, right? Is in their 50s or so, and so is looking for opportunities for more stable employment, but is having trouble finding it despite having all of this experience, despite having a doctorate of law. Pauli, from the late 60s to the early 1970s, ultimately finds work at universities across the country. She spent about a year working at Benedict College, which is a historically Black college in South Carolina. She leaves that position because she cannot deal with the heavy-handedness of the male president, who is very condescending and disrespectful to her as a woman professor. After leaving Benedict College, she does not have security, but something finds her. She gets a call from Brandeis University to teach there in Massachusetts and finds success at Brandeis University. I'll also offer in this period of her life, so this is the 1970s, Pauli is in her 60s, she manages to return back to that original aspiration of being a writer. Pauli had been writing poetry since she was in her 20s. Pauli wrote for many, many publications and always kept copies of what she wrote. Pauli is something of a pack rat. So at this time, she's able to take that collection of her copies of poetry from, the time she was in her 20s to this age, and she's able to put that into a collection of poetry called Dark Testament. And that poetry collection is another one of Pauli's works that is readily available to us. Now, Pauli, again, is at Brandeis. She publishes this poetry collection. She's thinking like, okay, this is it. Like, I'm gonna teach at Brandeis. I'm gonna retire comfortably. This is it for me. This is how I enter my twilight years. But Unfortunately, that's not quite how things played out. Pauli's life partner, Irene Barlow, passes away while Pauli is teaching at Brandeis University. And this is something of a cataclysm for Pauli. Pauli ends up in deep, deep grief. Pauli also is at a place where now she is forced to wrestle with her own mortality. Pauli is also devastated at how her partner navigated death. Irene had breast cancer and chose not to tell Pauli until she was well advanced into her sickness. And that was really difficult for Pauli as well. Irene didn't want to distract Pauli from her success of the poetry collection, her success at Brandeis University. And so again, this is a place where Pauli is really, really struggling. I'll also offer that Pauli is at a point in her life where she's frustrated with the work that she has done. She doesn't think that she's been successful in meting out race-based and gender-based discrimination in the country because it's still affecting people. And so she is in a place where her consciousness really is evolving. Pauli's grandmother, Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald, was a deep, deep Episcopalian. And so Pauli has a deep faith tradition. That's something that she and Irene share together. And so she turns to God to wrestle with some of these feelings that she's having. She also turns to God to think about how to approach these issues in society. She's realizing that race-based discrimination and sex-based discrimination are moral issues rather than simply social or legal ones. She's like, this requires the divine to work through. And so she ultimately decides to leave her tenured position at Brandeis University and enter divinity school. This is at a time where people, specifically women, are being excluded from leadership at the Episcopal church level, but she's still going to give this a try. And this is some of what Pauli says. As a matter of principle, my age and sense of unworthiness had insulated me against entertaining such a possibility for myself. It had taken a cataclysm, watching Irene in an abyss of suffering, to force my submission and obedience to divine will. Now that will seemed to be leading me into the unknown on a journey that demanded utmost faith and trust. And so it's at the age of 62 that Pauli enters seminary. As I stated, women had only recently been accepted into the particular seminary that Pauli entered, and Pauli was the only Black woman in her cohort. Pauli felt insecure in this cohort about her age, and generally it was a very challenging experience for her. Her classmates said that she did not meet the personality requirements to be a priest. Specifically, they said that she was not pastoral, that she was abrasive, and that she was rude, right? How would you feel if that's how your classmate perceived you, right? Yeah, that would be difficult, especially again, at the age that she was already feeling insecure. And I'll offer, as a Black woman, that is something that we hear just moving through everyday space, right? Trying to live our lives. And so to hear in the context of faith leadership and faith education was very, very difficult for Pauli. And I'll offer as an anecdote, some of the comment about Pauli being rude is because she would cut people off sort of mid-sentence if they were talking. And one of her friends said, let's go get you checked out. And it turns out Pauli was losing her hearing. She couldn't hear people which is why she was sort of cutting in and out. And so she had an added layer of now having an assisted listening device in her ear. And the technology in the 70s is not what it is now, right? So she had that added challenge to her schooling. And yet, if we know Pauli found joy, if you will, success, liberation on the other side. In 1977, at the age of 67, Pauli became the first Black woman to be ordained by the Protestant Episcopal Church to be a priest. And she, in a beautiful full circle moment, offered the Eucharist for the first time on February 13th, 1977 at Chapel of the Cross, that same faith space where her grandmother was baptized as an enslaved child in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I'll offer, in recent years, in the last decade, Pauli has been sainted by the Episcopal Church. And so if you hear people refer to Pauli as Saint Pauli, it is apropos. And again, she is a saint in the Episcopal Church. Pauli spent the last decade or so of her life preaching, teaching, giving sermons. She never found employment at a single Episcopal church, so she moved around quite a bit. She also earnestly wanted to document her life because she understood if she did not document her life, her contributions might be lost to history. And so she worked earnestly on an autobiography that is called Song in a Weary Throat. Pauli ultimately got sick, however. She got pancreatic cancer, and so quite literally spent the last days of her life earnestly trying to finish this book, but she was not able to do so. She passed away while writing Song in a Weary Throat in 1985, and it is friends, family members, and loved ones who came together to pull that manuscript together and ensure that it was published in 1987. And you heard me mention Pauli was a pack rat. Before she passed away, she had organized all of her papers as well. She edited some of her papers. Family members further edited some of her papers. So she was fickle about what she wanted us to know about her life. Nevertheless, she had that collection pulled together and was very clear with her family members around where she wanted it to go. That place that denied her entry, Harvard University. Okay, and so Pauli Murray's papers are held at Harvard University and are available to us today. And I strongly and firmly believe that if it weren't for Pauli's works, if it were not for Pauli's autobiography, if it weren't for Pauli very keenly and with incredible foresight pulling her personal papers together, we would not know much of what we know about Pauli Murray today. I'll offer that it's lovely the ways that Pauli's life and legacy are being amplified today. Some of you all might be familiar with the 2021 Amazon documentary, My Name is Pauli Murray. If you are not, it is a wonderful, wonderful watch. And again, available to you on Amazon Prime. Also, last year, around this time, we celebrated the release of the Pauli Murray Quarter. So Pauli has been sort of memorialized or commemorated on a U.S. quarter as part of the American Women's Quarters program. And so those quarters are available to you. You can buy them from the U.S. Mint's website. They're a really lovely something to have. And then finally, it's my great fortune to amplify and share Pauli Murray's life, work, and legacy with folks just like you as the executive director of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. That little house that was in a black and white image at the top of our talk, like I said, still stands today. And that home, Pauli Murray's childhood home, serves as the anchor space for the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, where we uplift Murray's life and legacy to tackle enduring injustices and inequities in our nation today. And I'll offer that over the course of about 15 years, folks banded together to ensure that Pauli's childhood home was preserved. It was slated for demolition in 2010, and so we completed that work last year, and we were finally able to open Pauli's childhood home to the public last September. And so if you've enjoyed this talk, if you want to know more, if you want to connect more deeply to the center, or just step foot in the sacred space that is Pauli's childhood home, I invite you to come to Durham and do so. We would love to have you. Thank you so much for your time today and your patience in awaiting our technical difficulties, but it was really wonderful sharing with you, and I think we might have maybe a minute or two for one or two questions. Thanks everyone. Any burning questions or burning comments, one or two?
So I have a question.
Sure.
The 700-page tome you talked about, compiling all of, there were 5,000 or so.
Under 5,000, yeah.
Yeah. Is it available today?
It is available today, but they're a little tricky to get your hands on. We were able to get one for an exhibit in the house through a website called abebooks.com. That's ABE, but the copy came from Germany. So again, like they're tricky to get your hands on, but you can find them. Yeah. Please.
Oh, I want to thank you because you are a very good speaker.
Thank you.
Murder Pauli Murray through our church, the local church, who does its Methodist, did a series on sleep. But they were people like her, Mr. Rogers, I mean, not your usual things. And my interest was what? Because of the Methodist church.
Yes.
Around.
Yes. Yes.
Then I got Miss Mary's Money.
Yeah.
Which is a book that talks more about it. And saw her in that too. So you never know where a little spark's gonna come.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, I do like a significant amount of talks for Episcopal folks, but I really feel like Methodists should dig in because she's deeply connected to their history. And I think state's laws on race and color really speaks to the activism work that the Methodist Church was doing that I'm not sure is amplified enough. So if you'd like to have me at your church, please invite me. I'd love to, please.
Of the rest of the family after they were separated.
We do. So Pauli had pretty decent relationships with her brothers and sisters. I'm trying to think. I think so. Pauli is one of 6 who survived. 3 ultimately stayed with her dad. 2 went to her dad's sisters, and then Pauli went to Durham. And I think one more person went somewhere else when William Fitzgerald fell into his depression. His sister and her husband took in all of the children again outside Pauli Murray, and they lived life in the Baltimore, Maryland, DC area. They went on to have children, and those children some of those children are still living today. In fact, one of them is on our board. Rosita Stevens-Holsey, who is Pauli Murray's niece, and they've gone on to have children. So we've got great nieces and great nephews who are connected to the center. I'll also offer for the Fitzgerald side, there are Fitzgerald descendants of Pauli Murray that are living and thriving in Durham as well. So Pauli's descendants are amongst us, which is something that is very, very special. Please.
Do you know where in Baltimore that should be?
I don't know exactly where in Baltimore. Yeah, I can't tell you the geographic location. Are you from Baltimore?
Yes.
Yeah. But she does write about it in Proud Shoes. So if you'd like more, pick up a copy of that book and you can see if you can like figure out exactly where, please.
I'm amazed that there doesn't seem to be more of a tinge of bitterness in Pauli's story. It doesn't seem to carry the weight of that. It just seems to carry the weight of moving forward. Always moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what I'll offer to that is everyone is complicated, including Pauli Murray. Her parents had a tumultuous relationship. Again, her father had that deep depression. He was violent towards her mother. Her mother would often flee to Durham to get away from him, even though this was against their values. The Fitzgeralds encouraged Agnes to divorce William to protect her and the children. There was also concern about her health, that she could not continue to carry pregnancies. And some people think that is part and parcel, something that led to her passing, right? Being pregnant with the seventh child. And they came in very quick succession. That is all to say, Pauli, for some reason, chose to remember her parents otherwise. And I think that's what children do, right? Despite how complicated the people who raised us may be, especially if they've passed away. And I can relate to this as someone who, as a young child, had a parent who passed away. You may deify your parents in spite of those complicated realities. And I think that is something that Pauli chose to do. And to your point about moving forward, I think, again, she chose to think about her life, her childhood in Durham as a fresh start and just as a way to survive and move forward.
But everything was not recognized in the time. And it just seemed to slow her down, and you don't hear stories of the way back, which is gracious.
Yes. Yes, thank Pauli. And I think to that point, I'll offer one more thing. And again, Pauli is so vast, you can't get into everything. But Pauli was slowed down at various points in her life. That gender struggle is something that was very difficult for Pauli to manage. The inability to find a loving partner and companion was something that was very difficult to manage. You heard me mention it, but time and time again, Pauli thinks that she failed. She ends her life thinking that she failed at her work. And these things taken together in combination with the challenges of being a Black woman in segregated America did stop her in her tracks many a time. It led to mental breakdowns, hospitalizations, her being institutionalized in mental institutions. And so there is a darkness to Pauli's reality that I think is important to name, and something that sometimes she writes about, but we know more because of her personal papers. But I think that's important to name because it helps us connect even more deeply to Pauli, because It makes her and her lived experience a more human one. Despite Pauli being a saint, she was a person. Of course. Of course. Think with that, we're close. Thank you.
I saw that quarter and at first I thought it didn't say hope. I thought it said nope. It would be totally appropriate this way. I knew nothing about her, but she just didn't take anything at face value. She just kept going right through. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna take a little break now. We're gonna do the business of the Historic Association. You're welcome to hang around, but it's just business. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, well, I'm listening.
We're gonna put up the CCHA,
What's that?
put up the CCHA slide.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. Good, good. I'm glad you liked it.